Most of the talk around narcissism centres around how to spot them, how to escape from them, and how to recover from their treatment, which is totally warranted because they can wreak absolute havoc on people and their relationships. But I learned something recently about narcissism that I'd never fully appreciated before, and it totally changed the way that I see them to the point where I feel genuinely sorry for them. So I'm going to share with you what I've learned about what narcissism really is and where it comes from, so that you might understand why they could be deserving of our pity. I'm Nicola, and for a long time I believed my mother was a narcissist. And while that might still be true, what I learned about narcissism that I'm going to share with you showed me that there was so much more going on under the surface than I ever realised. To understand why I feel sorry for narcissists, we have to understand something called complex PTSD. And if you want to learn more about this topic, there's a great book by Pete Walker called Complex PTSD, From Surviving to Thriving. I'll link to that in the description for you. But complex PTSD is a more specialised form of PTSD, and it develops in the situation where parents either abuse or neglect their children, also called abandonment. And this neglect or abandonment can be physical, it can be sexual, it can be mental, but it seems that actually at the core of most complex PTSD is emotional abuse or neglect. And when kids are in this kind of traumatic environment, they choose typically one of four standard responses. They do this to survive, they do this to defend themselves against his attack, they do this to cope with a constant threat of danger. And they do this in the hope that these responses will reduce any further trauma, maybe allow them to escape from this, or minimise or completely prevent any further trauma. And the response they choose depends on how they're being treated, their personality, which is strongly controlled by genetics, and where they are in the birth order in the family. And the four responses are fawn, freeze, flight, and fight. And in a healthy context, these responses are a constructive response to danger. So for example, the healthy fawn response might look like listening, helping others, making compromises, being in service to others, focusing on fairness and peacemaking. The healthy freeze response might look like becoming still, being very quiet, giving up or stopping struggling, having awareness or mindfulness, or being very present. The healthy flight response might look like disengaging or retreating to safety, or persevering, or being productive, or knowing how to make things happen. And the healthy fight response looks like having boundaries, being assertive, protecting yourself, having courage and leadership. But in the context of childhood trauma, what tends to happen is that kids focus exclusively on one of these four responses in order to try and cope with what's happening to them. And when they do focus on a particular one of these four responses, what it means is they have much greater trouble accessing the other three of these responses. And it also makes it much harder for them to relax, to go back into a non-defensive, non-hypervigilant state. And I've got a guide with quick ways to self-regulate that can help if you're trying to work through this kind of response. But this focus on one kind of strategy from this four is also a way to distract ourselves from the vicious, loud inner critic that develops in these situations, that tells us what's wrong with us and what's wrong with everything and everything that's going to go wrong. So we can use this strategy to distract ourselves from that voice. But also it can help us distract ourselves from the painful, intense emotions that we're experiencing. And these strategies, these coping strategies, might work in the context of childhood trauma as a defense mechanism, but we carry them into adulthood, which is when they become less helpful and less functional. And what happens is that we develop less healthy versions of these four responses. So for example, the fawn response in an unhealthy form might look like being obsequious or groveling or people-pleasing or being a doormat or a slave or a victim, and it can develop into codependence. The unhealthy freeze response involves hiding or isolation or being a hermit or being a couch potato or spacing out or just being an underachiever, and this can develop into dissociation and those kinds of disorders. The unhealthy flight response might be being panicky, rushing everywhere, worrying, being very driven, running on adrenaline, being very busy, micromanaging everything, aiming for perfection, and this can develop into OCD and ADHD. And the unhealthy fight response can be explosive. It may be controlling, demanding, entitled, type A type personality, and bullying. And this can develop into narcissism. And when I saw this breakdown into these 4 responses and how they can develop into these dysfunctional behaviours, this is what blew my mind. Realising that these responses, including narcissism, were a response to childhood trauma, and that this was just simply one coping mechanism that kids develop in order to cope in these environments. And so there are 5 things about narcissism that make it absolutely heartbreaking as far as I'm concerned. First is this realization that it develops as a response to trauma. It is an attachment disorder. And I've got a video that takes you through how childhood trauma can affect your attachment style that you might want to watch after this one. But it's caused by parental abuse or neglect. And the consensus is that 80 to 90% of narcissistic behaviours are learned behaviours. They are created by these experiences. And it's also influenced by personality. And personality is very heavily determined genetically. And my understanding is that which response you choose is determined by your personality. So in the case of a narcissist, they decided that fight was the appropriate response in order to cope with this childhood trauma. And when kids experience things like being spoiled or insufficient limits, this is actually a kind of abandonment. Or maybe they were simply in an environment where there was a bullying narcissistic parent that they learned to imitate as the effective strategy in that environment. But unfortunately, what this means is they learn distorted strategies. They learn the wrong ways to connect and to feel safe. And for a narcissist, they learn that in order to connect with people, they have to control people, they have to have the power in the situation, and that in order to feel safe, they need to get angry, and being angry is the way to feel safe. And this first cause of this narcissism is absolutely heartbreaking because this is not an environment they were in control of. This is something that happened to them and they learned this strategy as a way to cope. The second problem is that these behaviours that narcissists exhibit are encouraged by our current society, especially in men. Things like lack of empathy or a sense of entitlement or being very superficial and concerned with outward appearances or being arrogant or being very grandiose, having an inflated sense of self-importance, especially in the business world. These behaviours are actually encouraged, and empathy is actually undervalued and even scorned, making it so hard for narcissists to understand the impact their behaviours might be having on other people. And the third reason this is so terrible is that being a narcissist makes intimacy almost impossible. It's a form of insecure attachment, but their behaviours alienate others and they have a tendency to blame other people for their failings. And they use things like rage and disgust and contempt to intimidate and shame and control other people. They use other people as scapegoats or as captive audiences for their monologuing. And these behaviours are not conducive to intimacy. They demand to have their unmet childhood needs met through these relationships, and surprise to surprise, their partners don't respond well to that. The more they demand, the more their partners pull away, and the more their partners pull away, the more abandoned they feel, and the more angry and demanding they get. And it's just a vicious downward spiral from there. And the fourth reason that I feel so sorry for narcissists is that this condition is actually very hard to treat and heal. In extreme situations, narcissism turns into full-blown sociopathy, where they have absolutely no compassion for humanity whatsoever. And the consensus is that sociopaths are untreatable. And a slightly milder version of this is the charming bully, the person who can be very nice outwardly when they need to be, but only when it serves their purposes. But underneath, there is a mean streak, and they are working to get whatever they want without concern for anyone else at all times. And the charming nature is just another way to get their needs met. And the trouble is that they are convinced that they are flawless, they are perfect, there's nothing wrong with them, and that everyone else is the issue. And if they get help, they have to seek it voluntarily. It can't be foisted upon them. They will resist it to the ends of the earth if someone tries to impose it from the outside. So they have to have enough self-awareness to realize the cost that their behaviour is having, the impact that their negative behaviours is having on their relationships. And they need to find healthier ways to redirect their anger away from the people around them and towards the terrible things that happened to them in childhood. And the heartbreaking irony here is that the very thing that causes their severe dysfunction is the same thing that prevents them from seeking help with it. They see themselves as flawless, that everyone else is the problem, so why should they need help? And so they remain stuck, and that is heartbreaking. And the fifth reason that I feel sorry for narcissists is they are not aware, they are not self-aware, and they are not aware enough to realise that underneath all of this bravado and bluster and meanness and terrible behaviour, they are totally, completely and utterly miserable. And that's heartbreaking. Now, to be clear, I am not condoning narcissistic behaviour in any shape or form. I'm not apologising for it. I'm not excusing it. Having experienced it myself at the hands of my mother, it is not something I would wish on anyone. And if you still struggle with setting boundaries, like I do sometimes, I've got a step-by-step guide that you might want to download to help you with that. But now you might be able to see the absolutely awful lot that narcissists have been dealt in life, and how absolutely impossible it can be for them to escape their lot in life. And while you might not want to spend any time around them whatsoever, maybe you can start to understand why they might just be deserving of our pity, because no matter how terrible their actions are, being a narcissist totally sucks. And if you want to understand in more depth how childhood trauma screws with our relationships, watch this video next. Got questions? Comment below, and I'll see you in the next one.